Welcome everybody to the Introduction to Computer Science, episode 4. In this video, we're going to be talking about programs. So in our first video, we discussed how a computer is simply a machine that takes input and turns it somehow into output that we can use. And programs are the way in which we actually convert input to output. So the program is the middleman. Okay, so we can think of a program as simply a list of instructions that we write out in a certain order so that when it gets input, it knows how to produce an output that we can use. That's all a program is. So how do we actually go about creating a program? Well, we use these things called programming languages. So there are so many programming languages out there, but first we need to understand how the first programmers actually wrote their programs. So they did use something of a programming language, but it was what we talked about in our second episode. It was binary. It was simply the ones and zeros, and they would have to manually go through and convert the instructions that they wanted into zeros and ones. Nowadays, we have tools to do this, and we'll talk about them in the next episode. But these first programmers, they had to do so much work just to get the programs into zeros and ones. And they use these things called punch cards, and they would punch out holes so that light could pass through, and they'd use like light sensors, and if the light shone through, then it'd be a 1, and if it didn't, it'd be a 0. So this was a lot of work, and they developed methods and tools so that they wouldn't have to do this. So eventually they come up with this programming language called assembly, and this is like the very next level above ones and zeros, binary. Assembly is just a bunch of very specific instructions that tell the CPU exactly what to do. And then after the assembly, a bunch of people came up with a bunch of languages, and now we just have so many. But one of the first higher level languages was known as Fortran. I believe that's how you say it. And then came along C and like C++ and Java and Python, and I mentioned these last three because these are the ones that we see most often beginners learning, especially in university, but even on people's own time, they usually start with Python. We're going to be focusing on C++ in this series when I actually show you the programming concepts, because that's what I'm familiar with. Okay, so in the last video, we discussed how memory is just a grouping of off wires and on wires. And we also mentioned how we can split these wires up in such a fashion that we have multiple files. So we could have, in this case, we would have 5 files in the memory. Okay, so let's integrate this idea with programming. So a program, as we mentioned, is just a list of instructions that we write out using a programming language. So every programming language, except for binary, uses your native language. So in our case, it would be English. So we would write out our instructions using English in a text file. And then what we would do is we would save that into memory. And one thing to mention at this point is that programs don't have to be just one file. They can be, but usually we will separate out the code into multiple files so that it's more organized and easier to read. Another thing to mention at this point is there's always going to be what's known as a main function. So we haven't learned about functions yet. Just know that really there's a main file that all of the secondary files link up to. And that is, the main file is how the computer knows where to start. So it'll look for the main function or the main file and start there. Okay, so now that we know that a program is a list of instructions that takes input, turns it into output, and we write the programs using a programming language in multiple text files in English, let's talk about the different types of programming languages. So there are different types, and then there's different levels of programming languages. For example, I just want to mention this before we end the video. So we have 2 main types that I've seen pretty often. So we have something called OOP, which stands for Object-Oriented Programming, and then we have a type of programming called functional. So these are different, but we'll get into that more later. I just wanted to mention that there are different types of programming languages. And then secondly, we have different levels of programming languages. Low level is a language in which the syntax is very similar to binary. So low level means it's closer to binary, it's harder to comprehend, and it's harder to write. It's just harder in general. So we have low level, mid level, and high level. So you can probably guess what the mid and high level is going to be like. So mid level is just in the middle. It's not extremely close to binary, but it's somewhere in the middle. And then high level is really easy to comprehend. It's really easy to write, and it's not very complicated at all. And as we go in time, our programming languages get easier and easier to write and read.